Did you know that the Wars of the Roses only got that name over 300 years after they ended? Hello and welcome to World History Encyclopedia. My name is Kelly and today's video is all about the dynastic conflicts between the Yorks and the Lancasters in the 15th century, known as the Wars of the Roses. World History Encyclopedia is a non-profit organisation and you can find us on Patreon, a brilliant site where you can support our work and receive exclusive benefits in return. Your support helps us create videos twice a week, so make sure to check it out via the pop-up in the top corner of the screen or via the Patreon link down below. The Wars of the Roses, that wasn't actually a war at all, were a collection of dynastic skirmishes, intermittent battles, minor sieges, executions and murder plots between the nobility and the monarchy of England, which spanned for 4 decades between 1455 and 1487. The elite of England was split into 2 camps, with each side centred around a branch of descendants of Edward III of England, who reigned from 1327 to 1377. On one side was the Yorks, with Richard, Duke of York, King Edward IV of England, and King Richard III of England. And on the other, the Lancasters, with the insane King Henry VI of England and King Henry VII of England. The Wars of the Roses ended with the Lancasters eventually reigning victorious. And why have the conflicts between the Yorks and Lancasters been called the Wars of the Roses? Well, the quite romantic name was coined by the novelist Sir Walter Scott over 300 years later, because both families involved had livery badges, although not their most commonly used badges, with roses on them. York with a white rose and Lancaster with a red one. Prior to Scott's 1929 novel, Anne of Geierstein, the conflict was referred to as the Civil Wars. Of course, the conflicts were more complex than just the Yorks on one side and the Lancasters on the other. Each of the families had allies amongst the noble families of England, creating the wider group names of the Yorkists and the Lancastrians. These allies weren't static though, and families would swap allegiances over the course of the 40 years, depending on deaths, conflicts, and opportunities that arose. Did you know that only a small fraction of viewers are subscribers? Be sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss out on any of our new videos and to help us create more great history content. With so many players and with the conflicts lasting for 40 years, the Wars of the Roses had many causes and it was perpetuated further with new people and new motivations. The beginning of the discord can be traced to as early as 1399, when Henry Bolingbroke forcefully took the throne and made himself King Henry IV of England, and then murdered his predecessor, Richard II of England. Henry IV was the first Lancastrian king of England, as his father was John of Gaunt, the Duke of Lancaster. And despite regicide being shocking, it wasn't an unsuccessful political strategy. Henry IV became king and the Lancasters reigned, but the ascension of the infant Henry VI of England, who became a pretty incompetent ruler after the sudden death of his father Henry V, was much closer to the beginning of the Wars of the Roses, and his reign was marked by lawlessness in a part of his country and a failing economy. In 1453, just as Henry VI was reaching maturity, England lost to France in the 100 Years' War, and hot debate broke out amongst the English barons over what to do with France. Should they be more aggressive against them, as Henry V had done, negotiate a deal of some kind, or just abandon the mainland of Europe altogether? Of course, money was a huge factor, and overseas military campaigns didn't come cheap. Henry VI made some unwise decisions around this time due to his ineptitude, when he involved himself in personal disputes amongst his barons, and then in 1445 decided to marry the niece of Charles VII of France, Margaret of Anjou. Of course, his barons saw his marriage to a French noblewoman as submission to the French. not to mention the clear influence of Margaret over her very unwarlike king didn't do Henry any favours in the eyes of his nobles. He had unpopular courtiers around him, and the common people were unhappy with the high taxes, the corruption of the court, and the lack of local justice. With all of these pressures and the loss of all of England's territory in France, bar Calais, it's not all that surprising that Henry VI had a mental breakdown in 1453 and became so ill he couldn't move, speak, or recognise anyone. In a phenomenon referred to by historians as bastard feudalism, the barons and estate owners of England had been increasing their wealth, political power, and hold over land, which was weakening the power of the crown at the same time. They steadily increased their power, and remembering the first Lancastrian king who seized the throne, they became ambitious enough to think about doing the same thing. If they had a drop of royal blood, the powerful barons could persuade others, especially those out of favour with the king, to follow and support him. These powerful political players saw their chance to overthrow the rightful monarch, especially since there was no more war with France to occupy their retainers, so they could focus on their own private ambition. Of these powerful barons, the strongest was Richard, the Duke of York, who was the grandson of Edward III of England and the nephew to the Earl of March, who claimed to be a legitimate heir to Richard II of England. Not only did he have these claims to royalty, but he was also the richest man in England. With Henry's uncomfortable position on the throne, Richard was a pretty serious threat, and when Henry fell ill, Richard was the obvious choice for regent. Henry's popularity at this point was so low that the people saw Richard as something of a champion of reform, but really, he just wanted the crown. Richard had some pretty powerful allies, but he also had some powerful enemies, one of them being Queen Margaret, and the other, the ambitious Edmund Beaufort, Earl of Somerset, and descendant of Edward III. In May of 1455, the Earl of Somerset was taken care of. Namely, he was killed during the First Battle of the Wars of the Roses. But Queen Margaret was a far stronger opponent. Margaret took over the armies and ruled in her husband's stead, fighting back against the Duke of York until he was forced to flee to Ireland. In 1459, the so-called Parliament of Devils named him a traitor and disinherited his heirs. When Richard returned to England after his son defeated Queen Margaret in July of 1460, he visited Henry in the Tower of London and persuaded the king to name him heir. Despite the crown being in Richard's sights, him being king just wasn't meant to be, for in December of 1460 he was killed at the Battle of Wakefield by royalists led by the Queen. His head was put on a pike in York and crowned with a paper crown to remind everyone that he was a usurper. His failure to become king was far from the end of, but only fueled, the ambition of the Yorkists. Richard's son Edward became the next leader of the House of York and became the king and queen's #1 enemy. Edward, though, had powerful and wealthy allies, namely the kingmaker Richard Neville. Edward proved his worth when he won at the bloody Battle of Towton in March 1461, and in June of the same year, Henry was deposed and Edward became King Edward IV, the first Yorkist king. In 1470, Edward's old ally Warwick turned against him and recrowned Henry, but the next year, Edward won his crown back on the battlefield, and Henry's son and the Earl of Warwick were all killed in the process. After imprisoning Queen Margaret and murdering Henry on May 21, 1471, it seemed that the Yorkists had won the bloody wars. Edward IV ruled until his unexpected death in 1483, and there were a few Yorkist players, namely his younger brother Richard, the Duke of Gloucester, and Edward's son and heir, another Edward. The 12-year-old Edward succeeded his father, but of course, since he was just a boy, the barons all hovered around the young monarch, and none more so than his uncle Richard. The young Edward V of England was still uncrowned when he and his brother, another Richard, were imprisoned in the Tower of London. and became known as the Princes of the Tower, and in his stead, the country was run by none other than his power-seeking uncle, Richard. The princes were sighted a couple of times, but then disappeared. It was widely rumoured that Richard had killed them, and this accusation was adopted by Tudor historians and William Shakespeare. It makes sense, seeing that Richard was the one to gain the most from Edward V's death, and he was crowned Richard III of England on July 6, 1483. Taking the throne by murdering a young boy, though, was not received well, and here the Lancastrians raised their heads once more. The House of Lancaster was now being led by Henry Tudor, descended from Edward III, which was a bit of a tenuous connection, but it was all the Lancastrians had, considering Henry VI left no surviving heirs. Henry Tudor found himself some powerful allies, including outraged former Yorkist supporters and Charles VIII of France. It may have been the death of Richard III's heir, who was yet another Edward, that re-sparked the Wars of the Roses, since it meant that Richard III was the only man between Henry Tudor and the throne of England. In August of 1485, Henry Tudor landed in South Wales with an army of French mercenaries and marched to meet Richard's army at Bosworth Field. Richard was deserted by his key allies and then was killed when he rashly charged at Henry Tudor himself. Henry Tudor was crowned as Henry VII of England on the 30th of October 1485. In 1487, there was a Yorkist revival, but it was quashed at the Battle of Stoke Field, which marked the final act of the Wars of the Roses. Henry VII founded the House of Tudor, and when he married Elizabeth of York, the daughter of Edward IV, he united the two sides. He even made a new symbol for the new dynasty, the Tudor rose, which combined the red and white roses of the Yorks and Lancasters. Henry was succeeded by his son, Henry VIII, and the Tudors reigned during what is now seen as a golden age for England, until the death of Queen Elizabeth I in 1603. The Wars of the Roses were mostly confined to the nobility, and although some of the battles would have caused death, destruction, and disruption where they occurred, many areas of the country were completely unaffected. It certainly did affect the nobility though, with half of the lords of the 60 noble families being killed. And, despite the barons profiting off the wars, by the end, the king was back in charge of his kingdom and supervising taxes. The biggest mark the wars left beyond the deaths of lords was on English culture, with the twists and turns of the 40 years of disagreements, inspiring historians and fiction writers ever since. William Shakespeare was particularly interested in the period, writing his historical plays Henry VI and Richard III on the topic. Even in the modern day, we are seeing the inspiration of the Wars of the Roses through authors such as George R.R. Martin, turning to history as a foundation for characters and themes in Game of Thrones. Who do you think had the best claim to the throne during the Wars of the Roses? Let us know what you think in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on our new videos published every single week. This video was brought to you by World History Encyclopedia. For more great articles and interactive content, head to our website via the link below. If you like my sweater, you can find this design and a bunch more in our shop at worldhistory.store, or you can find a link for it down below. Thank you so much for watching, and we will see you soon with another video.